Welcome to day 2 of the Focus Around Distractions workshop. Today we're going to get into a really fun and interesting topic, the science around arousal. And this is a huge topic that we don't have time to go into a whole ton of detail because we could talk for hours. We want you to understand some of the basic terminology and some of the ways that that applies to working with your dog in distractions. And so with that, we're going to kind of jump right into the workshop, and I hope you enjoy it as much as we do. And so Elliot, you're up first. You're still muted.
Thank you. Typically, when we're talking arousal, most people's brains are going to jump to the concepts of fight, flight, and freeze, which we're really familiar with as humans when we talk about this in our own kind of trauma and fear responses. So, fight or flight is just like with people. Your adrenaline starts pumping, and you get prepared to either take off and get away from whatever's frightening you, or your body gets ready to fight whatever you think is coming at you. Our dogs are much the same way, and each dog kind of responds in its own independent way by their personality. You have some dogs who, when they get frightened, they turn around, growl, bark, lunge. Other dogs, they want to take off, tail tucked, and just get out of Dodge, just like us. Freeze is where your dog really starts to lock up and kind of shut down. So it's the opposite in a way of our fight or flight response, because instead of running or fighting, our dogs and us, we just lock into place. This is where you'll get dogs who will crouch down and hide, who just stand there frozen, bodies incredibly tense, intently staring or hiding their face, just trying to not be in that moment, essentially, is what their brains are trying to do. You'll also have similar effects on like their guts. Fight flight tends to cause really strong stress responses to the guts, and you get issues with nausea and diarrhea. With freeze, you might see constipation arise as a result, where everything just shuts down and gets interrupted. You will also notice that you can have dogs that are really openly terrified, as we're wording it. So those are the dogs that are barking, snarling, snapping. Clearly they're doing something. They're hiding, they're running. Very visible, obvious signs of stress. The lip licking, the whale eyes. But you also have dogs that get quietly terrified. And this is something that we notice in particular when we flood our dogs and we overstimulate them to the point where they shut down and freeze. You'll notice that they suddenly stop behaving, and they might look really, really, really well behaved, but they're actually in a state of terror and overwhelm where they're not moving because they're too scared and overwhelmed to move. And so you'll have dogs, especially dogs that have been unprepared for public, who might look like they're really well behaved, but at any moment, if they were given the chance, they would want to get out of there. But they don't have that chance, so they just curl up and look, for all intents and purposes, like they're
Did I
okay.
kind of talk about this one just briefly?
Absolutely.
So this one is I wish I knew more about it years ago kind of thing, and that's why it's super important to me. So when Azul was a puppy, we played a lot of the look at that game, right? He's a super confident dog and it's never really been fearful, but these same fight, flight, freeze responses can happen with the overexcited dog too. The dog that is just overwhelmed because they want something so badly. And so that was Azul's case. And I thought, and like you said, they can look like they're really well behaved. So when Azul was around, maybe 7 months old, he started this pattern of as soon as he saw another dog on the trail, and of course he wanted to play with that other dog really bad, but he would just lay down and watch and wait for that other dog to get close. So in my, untrained at the time brain, I thought, oh, that's great. He's playing the look at that game. And he would take reinforcement and he would look at the dog and look back at me, and just, he appeared calm and great. And so I accidentally reinforced it a little bit too much and kind of encouraged it a little bit too much. And so then fast forward to when he was maybe about 12 to 14 months old, he still had that same pattern because that's what he thought we were supposed to be. But that's when the adolescent brain is changing. And now he was a little bit more fearful of dogs, and not necessarily fearful in the way of like wanting to run away or attack, but just unsure of what was going to happen. Was he going to get to see this dog? Was he going to get to play with this dog? Was he going to have to move away and give this dog space? Just the unknown would amp him up so much that he would freeze and then literally just be able to do nothing but stare at the dog. And staring is kind of a husky trait. And so I allowed it a lot more than what I should have, which brought us to fast forward to when he's about 18 months. And now he's extra confident and super just positive in where he's at. He's had positive associations his whole life. And now I noticed that anytime another dog, and especially male dogs, but anytime another dog that we didn't know was walking near us, that dog was showing signs of fear and terror, just because Azul carries himself so confidently. He's got that husky swoop. He's got that, all that body posture that says, I'm here, I'm large, I'm proud kind of thing. And so even though he would lay down when that dog was approaching, he still had that unsureness of how is this dog going to react to me. And for me, I don't like the idea that my dog is making any dog scared or terrified. So I'm going to give space to that dog, even if my dog doesn't need it. And so I had to really, really work with Azul a lot on that give space. So my whole point is recognizing that freeze for what it is and working with it at an early age, not necessarily to prevent it, but to redirect it so that it doesn't become the habit of what the dog thinks they're supposed to do. Because now if another dog gets scared enough that it barks at him and I don't give space, Azul will lunge at that other dog right after they pass. And of course, that's what I want to prevent. I don't want him practicing that lunge, nor do I want him to scare the other dog in that way. And even though Azul's doing it to try to snip the butt or play or whatever, it terrifies other dogs. And so Azul is kind of in that quietly overexcited. So you think quietly terrified, but take the opposite end of the spectrum, and he's quietly overexcited until he can't contain it anymore and that explosion happens. And so we really, really need to be careful with that. And that's kind of why freeze is set on its own. You hear the fight, flight, and freeze all the time together. But the freeze, I think, is one that people just don't recognize because it does look like a well-behaved dog. And people want to reinforce that, it looks like they're doing what they should. And so we have to really, really be careful with that. And did you have anything else you want to add before I advance it?
Not at the moment. If there is something I want to add, I'll probably add it in at the end of everything just to make sure it isn't something we don't already cover.
Perfect. All right. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of other emotional stress reactions, and these go along with the fight, flight, or freeze, but a lot of people don't know them. So fawn is where your dog might either appear to have an injury or appear to get really small. Maybe they're crouching down, but not in like that playful bow kind of crouch. They're basically trying to hide and be invisible when they're in fawn mode. They want the other dog or the other person or whatever it is, that distraction that's causing them to either be overexcited or fearful. They want that dog not to be able to see them. So fool around is kind of like the exact opposite. They become the class clown. They're the dog that might be jumping up and down like a kangaroo, or jumping up and biting the leash, or doing any behaviors that are just silly. And it like brings all eyes on me. And that's a dog that's struggling emotionally to control their arousal level, whether it's high arousal because of fear or high arousal because they just want to play, or maybe they're just overstimulated or trigger stacked, which is something we'll get into in a moment. But so those are things that we still need to watch out for and realize them as strong emotional reactions that can cause stress to the brain. I'm going to get a drink real quick. And so it's kind of important to understand how that stress impacts the brain so that we can help our dogs be more relaxed and more neutral. We've all kind of known that dog that just like it had to go. It could not lay down and sleep. It had to go, 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 go all day long. And that's a dog that hasn't learned how to lower its brain ability to slow down. And so that's caused from having a lot of stress very young in life. And I mean, it could even be caused from having stress before the pup is born if the mom is in lots of stress. The whole idea with this presentation today is that we learn just a little bit about how those stress levels go up and down and how we can reduce them to make it better for our dogs. So. And Elliot, you want to talk a little bit about the understanding those stress behaviors?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stress behaviors that are pretty obvious to pick up on. Like they're very easy to see. So things like lunging, barking, whining. Whale eyes, pretty visible on a lot of dogs. And lip licking, although that can be a lot more subtle and will also depend on the dog itself. There are certain dogs that we know are prone to having more licking behavior because they might be missing teeth. Like my dog, he has only 11 teeth at this point in his life because of his breed, and he just licks his lips a lot more, even when he's otherwise calm, because that's just how his mouth works now. So that's one of those that can vary a little bit more depending on your dog. Looking at how their ears are presented, are they very far forward or are they pinned? Um, is your dog doing a hard stare, a very intense stare? Is your dog kind of making itself taller, almost standing on the very tips of its toes, just trying to get a better look or make itself look bigger? These are these are pretty visual to pick up on, but you can also see behaviors like the yawning. Um, some dogs you'll see where they stop paying attention to your cues, they become slower to respond or stop responding altogether. You'll see dogs start to refuse food, or maybe they'll start taking food a lot more eagerly than they did before and almost frantically nipping at your hands when you try to present them with food. Um, these are all some really good examples of how to tell when your dog is getting stressed. And usually you'll notice kind of different behaviors at different levels of arousal. Again, this can vary with each dog, partially because some dogs are more vocal and other dogs are less vocal. So some dogs may start to vocalize at a lower level of stress because they can think while they talk. Some dogs, though, they can't think while they talk. So if you're hearing vocalization, you know that your dog may be at a higher level if they're normally a pretty quiet dog. Um, Typically, you see at a lower level of arousal when the dog can still think, you'll start to see them be a little slower on their cues because they're a little distracted. You'll see them kind of staring more frequently at whatever the trigger is, paying less attention to you. They might become extra sniffy at that point because they're trying to get more information about the trigger. And so, especially if the trigger's far off, you might see more of that air scenting, especially with a noticeable open mouth, because they're really trying to get that information about what they're concerned about. You may see more of the forward ears at that point, um, depending on the dog, but usually you'll see forward ears at that point rather than pinned ears. The yawns usually appear once you get to a little bit higher, and the lip licking and the whale eyes. And vocalization for most dogs is you're definitely over threshold. Same with lunging and pulling. And again, your results will vary depending on your dog, but those are some of the typical levels of arousal, starting at lower to higher. Um, so another way to think about this is when you see your dog is starting to have a a reaction where they're no longer at their baseline. I, we call them conversation starters. And this is a time to stop and ask your dog, check in with them and say, hey, how are you doing and why? So some people call this like taking your dog's temperature, metaphorically speaking, trying to figure out, are you excited in a good way? Are you starting to get nervous about something? And how can we bring those emotions back down? So, some of the ways you can do this is checking in with your dog and asking for eye contact, seeing how easy and willing they are to give eye contact, how easily they can follow your cues. If you're starting to see that latency, that delay to following cues, you know that they know really well. Like if your dog normally can automatically sit down and now your dog is taking like 5 seconds to listen, you know there's something going on. And so if you look at this as a way as a conversation with your dog, you can then take the approaches and say, "Hey, let's go relax a little bit. Maybe we should stop and sniff at a distance, give my dog more distance so they can observe and process whatever's happening more accurately and without the same pressure that they would have if they were closer to the stimulus they're viewing." So if they're too concerned about something, they're just going to be intent on it and not really process properly because they're so stressed. They might try to make the thing go away by barking and lunging or come closer by barking and lunging rather than actually process, oh, that's just, that's just a fire hydrant or, that's just a person in a hat that they don't know yet. And so if they give them the time and the distance to process, that arousal level can come back down. Also, letting your dog engage in things like sniffing or other forms of relaxing movement, pattern games, all of these things can help bring our dog back to baseline. But it all starts by having a conversation with our dog. Hey, how are you feeling? And why might you be feeling that way? Anything you want to add in, Penny? Or
No, you covered it really well. I just like to do conversation starters with my dog to kind of assess what their stress level is. So, I mean, that one is kind of important to me. If you do a couple of simple basic behaviors, so a simple conversation starter for me is either saying my dog's name or doing a double tap on my leg. And both of those will get his attention to look at me if he's not overstimulated. And then we can do a couple of hand targets or a couple of fun things to just see how much focus he has on me versus the distraction. But so those are really big, and you covered that fairly well. And so you want to talk a little bit about trigger stacking as well?
yeah, so there's a few different metaphors you can think about when you're talking about trigger stacking. We're going to use the metaphor filling the bucket. I've also seen people use an idea of candles boiling over a pot of water. But basically, the way trigger stacking works is you've got a bucket, and let's say on a good day, it starts out pretty empty. So, on a good day, you're starting out with nothing in the bucket, and you hear a sound that frightens you. Well, that's some drops of water in the bucket. And then you get hungry, your dog is hungry. Well, there's some other drops of water in the bucket. And each size of this drop of water in the bucket depends on how stressful the event is. And then that's impactful on how big of a bucket does your dog have to start with. Because let's be honest, some of our dogs have bigger buckets than other dogs, just based upon their personality, where they're at in their training, and their resilience. So, you have these things that start to happen, and over time, as you go throughout your day, you start to fill up the bucket with event after event after event. Sometimes you can take water out of the bucket a little bit, such as taking a break, relaxing, eating food, removing whatever the trigger was and giving yourself time to relax. But if that bucket is filling up without the chance to remove water from that bucket, eventually you're going to get to a point where that bucket starts to slosh and eventually completely overflow. And so that's the same idea behind trigger stacking. You're just putting water in the bucket. And we want to find ways to prevent that water from either getting in there or enable ways to get that water out before we hit that over threshold. And all of a sudden, our dogs are going from, yeah, we're interested in the thing to we are barking, lunging, so stressed out of our mind that we can't function. And so when we think about a trigger, we think about how the ways it can impact the body and mind throughout the day because things can stack on top of it. So the impacts to the body it has is so really quickly, just because I had thought about this earlier and it ties in here now really well. There is a term that a lot of people have heard at this point. Maybe they don't know fully what it is, but the concept of polyvagal theory is that things that happen that stress us can have that really somatic effect on our body. It impacts the way our body works, not just how our emotions are. So the emotions impact our body. So things like if you're really stressed and you get a headache, or you might feel tension in your back or your stomach or your throat. The same things happen to our dogs. So if our dogs are constantly being triggered, you're going to start to notice things like digestive problems. You'll see dogs who start to get upset tummies really easily, or have diarrhea frequently. Or just have diarrhea right after the stressful event, and then they're fine. But right after, you have that really negative impact on their digestive tract. You will see behaviors that can emerge that are kind of obsessive and can become unpleasant to the dog or harmful to the dog, like repetitive licking or other obsessive repetitive behaviors like water biting or chewing on themselves, trying to self soothe, and this can wind up impacting the body really negatively. You can see the stress it puts on your dog's body as they get really tight muscles and really tighten up. You can notice they don't take deep breaths as much as they should, which is going to have impact depending on if they have a really physical job and they're not, taking the time to just breathe and relax their body. That can then lead to them being more prone to injury because their muscles are not as relaxed as they should or could be. And of course, the impacts to the mind is with repeated exposure to these triggers and without allowing that bucket to kind of empty over time, you're going to keep filling up that bucket faster and faster and faster. Because yesterday, if you got overflowed, you might not have an empty bucket starting your next day. You might be starting out the next day with your bucket already half full. And so that means you're going to be faster to hit that trigger overflow. It also means repeated exposure can turn a small fear into a much bigger fear, which will lead to those patterns of avoidance and hitting those thresholds faster. Where your dog used to, walk by, maybe lip licking a particular area, now they see the area and they begin to whine because they're hitting that threshold so much faster and have a much more negative emotional response to it. And that in turn can lead into those repetitive obsessive behaviors I mentioned before, which then impacts the body again. Penny, anything else you want to add on, or?
No, I think you covered that very, very well. So thank you. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about things that we can do with triggers to help make them not impact our dogs so much. And if you look over to the right, you'll see a list of games that were in our Focus Around Distractions 1 workshop that come very, very handy for this. So I want to talk a little bit about creating that exit strategy. You know, if we're working on desensitizing to a trigger, you know, maybe it's other dogs. Well, that's a common one, so I'll use that just as an example. So if your dog gets overexcited or fearful around other dogs, you may set up training exercises to kind of work on that. But then all of a sudden there's another dog in the area that you weren't expected, either in that training session or you're going on a walk and you come across another dog and you just don't like the looks of it. And you think, you know, you don't know if it's going to be a positive experience. And I always tell people, if you don't feel 100% sure that's going to be a positive experience, you need to exit the area, give space. And how far you give space is going to depend on your dog and what you're reading from the other dog. So for Azul, if I back up 6 feet, that's generally enough space for him and he knows he's not interacting. But because the other dog sometimes may need 20 feet or 30 feet or even, you know, a football field or more than 100 yards, we will judge it based on the other dog's need and keep moving back, watching that stress of the other dog. But so when it comes to an exit strategy, that can be really various for different teams. So one dog team might really benefit from just doing a U-turn and go in the opposite direction. And so there's a U-turns game in the FAD1 exercise that involves cones and kind of practicing that so it becomes muscle memory. U-turns don't necessarily work for Azul because he's got that husky desire to look that I previously talked about. And so for him, doing a U-turn was almost punishment and like super hard work. I can get him to do it with cones now, but in a real life situation, it's just too overwhelming for him and will cause him to go into that freeze mode. And so we switched to doing like a 90-degree turn. And so we'll walk off to the side where he can still focus on me, but take those quick glances at the other dog, which allows him to, answer to me, work with me and still meet his needs to watch. And so it's kind of a win-win. And then sometimes you can use a visual barrier as your distraction. So stepping behind something to block vision can help your dog or the other dog. And it's kind of funny with dogs because we can step behind almost anything. And it doesn't matter if they're still visible. Like if you step behind a narrow tree and that dog's head and tail is still sticking out both sides, it still can provide that level of comfort because dogs work on a vertical plane more than the horizontal plane. So if they have something vertical anywhere in between them and the dog, they are more likely to relax and feel safe in that instance. So when I'm working with a team, I will work really, really hard to help them find that exit strategy that works for them. And so that they can, find that one thing that works. And then we will practice that over and over again in game patterns, in fun things without any triggers around. And then we will set it up to practice that in a controlled environment with the trigger at a distance that we can control and slowly work up to being able to do that in real life situations. One of the important things there is that you are preventing at all costs, you're doing your best efforts to prevent the accidental triggering when you're not anticipating it before you've got that exit strategy developed real securely. So the big key things are know your environment. So know which way you can go. Some environments you might be blocked. You might only be able to turn and go backwards. I try to avoid those environments since I know that can be triggering to Azul. I mean, we might walk through tight spaces as long as I can see it up ahead far enough that there isn't something that's going to come, face to face in that tight space. But so know your environment and know how to get out of that environment. If your dog is overly fearful, then choosing environments that have wide open exit places are important. And kind of a key thing to learn or note that I just recently learned from one of my dog behavior workshops is So if a dog is, say there's another dog approaching and they're at a safe distance and your dog's just a little unsure, if they turn to look at a tree or at something else in the distance that's off sideways, that's often a really quiet signal that they're uncomfortable with this dog. So generally, if they're comfortable, they're going to look at the dog or look back at the handler. But if they're looking like off into space, the person that was doing the training called it the invisible squirrels. It looks like something else has their attention, and maybe they're having nose down to the ground, or maybe they're looking at a tree, or maybe they're looking like they want to go sniff a tree or go check out a slide or whatever they're looking at. It's the fact that they're not looking at the trigger and not looking at the handler, and it looks like they're excited for something else or want to get to something else. And so that's your key right there, that you need to do your exit strategy, which might involve letting them walk to whatever it is they're focusing on, because that might give them the distance they need, or it might be going into your pattern game that you've taught and how you want them to do it. So sometimes zigzags help, sometimes walking at a diagonal or going behind a barrier. Sometimes it's just doing that U-turn and get it out of the environment. So really think about that and what your dog, those little things your dog are telling you beforehand, because that's how you plan your exit strategy. Go ahead, Elliot.
Yeah, I just wanted to say most people are familiar with dogs having trouble when they're closer to the trigger, but there are some dogs that have more trouble at a distance. Maybe it's because they aren't able to perceive the potential trigger as well at a distance, and so it's more frightening that way, or because it's so far off, it's more unexpected. Maybe it came out of nowhere. So sometimes, depending on your dog, you really read your dog, it might actually be helpful to get closer just a little bit rather than give more distance. So that's also something to keep in mind depending on your dog and the way that they feel about a situation. Just getting closer so they can practice that processing can really help bring them back down.
Yep, sometimes there is that fine line of knowing when to encourage them, to give them that support, tell them they're safe, help them relax, let them sniff the ground a little bit or move a little bit closer, and then back off. But it's it's supporting them. So the ultimate choice becomes the dog's decision, unless they're dragging to the trigger in overexcitement or fear to try to get to that. If they're dragging you to the trigger, then they're already too elevated in order to actually do anything. So that's really when you need to slide into your exit strategy. But the goal is to get them before they're already triggered, and then let them experience it just a little bit and process it a little bit more before you lead them away or go behind your barrier or whatever your exit strategy is. So pay attention to those subtle body things that your dog is doing that might be telling you what they're thinking in the moment. If they're darting their eyes back and forth rapidly, that means they're probably looking for a safe place to get to. If they're able to easily, glance at the trigger and back at you, they're probably good. They might be a little anxious, but then you might be able to do a scatter feed and slowly work your way up, or you might be able to play a little game and slowly work your way up. So pay attention to those subtle signs. And if you are struggling with those subtle signs, that's exactly when you need to reach out to one of the canine coaches. So with the Q&A that's going to be tonight, that might be a really good one. If you're having issues with exit strategies, pop on into the Facebook group, the FAD discussion group, and join in the live Q&A that night, because we can really help you maybe fine tune a little bit more, or at least lead you to other resources, or let you know how we can work with you virtually in order to help you if it's a more complex problem. We can't solve the world's problems in that live, but we're willing to help answer questions the best we can. And so with that, I'm going to go right into my game for the day. And so the Fool Around game, this can be really helpful for dogs, especially the ones that go into that class clown, that fidget, or that Fool Around mode. easily when they're overexcited. And so I'm going to go ahead and play this video to show this Great Dane's fool around, but let me set it up a little bit. So when this Great Dane was a very young adolescent, maybe 6 to 7 months old, the fool around was her freeze response when she got distracted by something or fearful of something. So I had her on a walk one day and did not know that she had a slight fear of lakes. And so as we approached the lake, she got more jumpy, more bitey, more trying to play. And I didn't realize that at the time that was her way of saying, hey, I don't want to get close to this water. And so once we actually got close enough that it caused more drastic reactions, I realized it. But the whole goal is realizing that fool around can be, part of the symptoms. And so the act of fooling around typically will somewhat help the dog release stress naturally, which is why they go into that state. When they're over aroused, whether it's fearful or happy, they'll go into that state. And so we developed that in this Great Dane. She is actually a service dog. So when she started doing public access training, we made it a habit at the end of every training to encourage the fool around pattern, because that is what helped her release stress. And so that's what you're seeing in this video. It's really short, maybe 90 seconds, but we just finished a PA training. She worked really, really hard. She did awesome in the store because she knows at the end she gets to come out and fool around. So this is Willow and her fool around pattern. We don't need volume. But so owner's engaging, she doesn't fool around until the owner starts it now versus later. So the owner's encouraging it in this moment because it's happy. And rather than let her pull on the leash, we were in a secured place, a very slow parking lot with a fence all the way around. So it was kind of safe to let her just have her time to get out and away. And so that is the fool around with Miss Willow video. And so that video is actually going to be linked in the blog page as well. So if you want to see it again or want to see a little bit more about fool around, it's there. So you can really encourage that for your dogs that love to do it. I have another team. Echo is one of Azul's really good friends, and she's still young, working her way through adolescence. So impulse control is really hard for her. And so she goes into this fool around mode as she's getting closer to me and Azul because she wants to play with him so bad. So she's either pulling or fooling around. And so in that case, her person will redirect the fool around to be focused on her for a minute and then bring Echo back down into a calmer state before they actually get closer. And that's a way that we can work with helping her to learn to process those emotions as an adolescent and learn how to self-regulate it herself. And so that's our goal. We've set it up in a way that she doesn't have to go miles and miles to get to Azul once she sees him, so that she's just having to go a short distance. So she's not practicing it so long that she's getting frustrated. But so she's working on turning that fool around into a fun, reinforcing method that can then help her calm down more quickly when she does see a distraction. And so with that, Elliot, you want to talk about the next game, the middle and weaves? Do you want me to play the video first, or do you want to talk first?
Let's play it and I can kind of detail as it goes.
Perfect. All right, so this is Cindy from Clovis Paws for Play and Nick.
And so she's using a toy unicorn, and encouraging Nick to do some movements of weaving between her legs. So this is doing some of the same act of the fool around and play, but also kind of combining it with a soothing pattern of motion. Because when your dog has this pattern to follow, that kind of routine motion, it can really help to soothe them, which is why pattern games are useful for your dogs that are having big emotions and feeling reactive towards things. So by combining a game with that repetitive motion of weaving, it can both soothe take the fool around energy as well as soothe even further with that repetitive motion.
It also allows you to build in that reinforcement for the under position, which for a lot of people is a default safety position. If your dog is small enough to get into it, that can help give your dog that safety. And it's also a way to protect your dog. So might be more widely used in the service dog community, but I've done this with fearful dogs as well. One of the first things that I want owners to kind of work on when they have a fearful dog is playing this game and creating this pattern. And I have one Aussie right now that when he came to me, he came early into the winter when getting together was really hard due to outside weather conditions, and his handler is disabled and I am disabled. So we really didn't work on it much. And then when I opened the training center, we started working on it a little bit more, and we taught him this particular game, this, leg weaves and going around and going under. And it increased their teamwork so much that this dog, some of it is his age and learning to control those emotions a little bit better. But part of that is also the teamwork that they've developed. And so in just this few short months, with even not working that much together in the first couple of months, in the last 3 weeks since they've started playing this game, I've seen remarkable changes with this dog when he comes across the trigger. And for him, triggers are dogs and people because he wants to play with them so badly. And then he's also been attacked by dogs. So he wants to play right up to the moment that they get nose to nose. And then he becomes very uncomfortable very fast. And so this under position is a way that the owner can get the dog there doing leg weaves until the distraction gets close enough. And then if the distraction becomes too close and invading their space bubble, the owner can then stop that other dog from invading the bubble and keeping his dog safe. So that can become a default safety position. So that is a really good one. And so with that, we are done talking about high arousal. We hope you join us for the Facebook Live tonight, the question and answers. And we hope to see you all on day 3.